Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 55. The continuation of the trying something new era of my show. I'm shooting in a different spot, the kitchen table. Hopefully the animals aren't going to go crazy and make a huge amount of noise. The cockatiel is just sitting over there, and he may very well make a lot of noise. But I thought of shooting at my kitchen table because this is episode 55. That reminds me of a character I created named Meek Foster, Matthew Meek Foster. That's officially his number. I have all these random number associations that don't make a lot of sense. His number makes a little bit more sense because his name is Matthew. He had a jersey that said 55. He played tennis. He had a jersey that said 55. So that's a reference to Matthew 55. The meek shall inherit the earth. Ha ha ha. Funny Easter egg. And his nickname was Meek. Ha ha. Funny Easter egg. But I wrote his story. I wrote a couple of stories with him, but I wrote a story called Water or Mr. Foster Elevates. At the kitchen table, while I was writing a novel called The Living Needle, and also while I was writing the novel called The Living Needle, I started another novel called Troubles and Struggles. Just what I do. But I just, I couldn't stop this idea. I had to sit down at the kitchen table. It might have been the same kitchen table. It was in a different town, but I think it was the same kitchen table. And I just couldn't stop. I just couldn't stop that story from coming out. And I went to see Karen White with my mom this weekend, and Karen White and I have a very different style in many ways, which is an interesting thing to meditate on. I mean, she writes about ghosts. I am very interested in ghosts as characters. I'm going to start writing a story about ghosts, but my style in approaching ghosts is going to be very different. She writes, really popular, lighthearted sort of mystery series. And I would never, I'm interested in magical realism. And saying that what I do is magical realism, what she does is more popular sort of mystery with ghosts and things like that. I would never want to be elitist in that sort of comparison. It's just, we happen to write different things. But I'm very interested in just all genres and different people's perspectives on how they approach their genres. How does a magical realist think of things like ghosts and flying and things like that? How do they think of it differently than somebody who's very consciously writing the more popular sort of style of supernatural mystery and things like that. So that's a fascinating thing. But one thing that we definitely had in common that I noticed just in her reading, I've heard her read a couple of times or speak a couple of times. This is my second time. But she's one of my mom's favorites, and I definitely wanted to go see Karen White with my mom. My mom, just had a great time. She loved it very much. Went to Charleston. Great place for ghost stories for sure. And my approach to Charleston was very different. I wrote a Charleston story called Beyond the Sky, which took the concept of Charleston and really made it really absurd. The perspective of anyone not from Charleston of Charleston is that it's this very full of itself, let's just say, full of itself sort of a city. It's a beautiful city. We're very proud of it in South Carolina. But the perspective of anyone not from Charleston is that it's very full of itself. In a loving way. We love Charleston, but Charleston is a very Charleston city. That's the only way to describe it. So my version of Charleston is, just that they outlawed gravity, they outlawed technology. It's just a really absurd sort of exaggerated version of Charleston. But anyway, Bill Murray as a character. It's just a silly, absurd version. But back to Meek Foster. The thing that I have in common, I'm getting way off track. I'm getting distracted by how manic the animals are being. It's turning me manic all of a sudden. The cockatiel sideways. At least he's not screaming. He'll do that just for hours. He'll just scream. He's old and cranky. I love you, but you're old and cranky. But the thing that Karen White talked about is definitely, absolutely something that we have in common. She talked about how a character just started speaking in her head, and and when writers talk about that kind of thing, it seems kind of crazy. But I was like, I totally hear you, Karen White. And she's a very sweet, wonderful person. So me saying we have a different style, I'm just purely talking about the different style. But that is something that's definitely true, and of a lot of writers, where a character will sort of just pop up and just possess you, and you have to write about him. And treating a character that way, endows them with subjecthood, which I think is one of the really essential things to always keep in mind. The cockatiel might be getting in the cranky mood right now. But subjecthood, I think, is one of the essential things to really think about in treating a character. Just no matter what, really. Allowing the character freedom to discover themselves. And I talked about this with Harold Pinter, and I think that's one of the real values of that sort of Harold Pinter sort of approach to creating a character. Just listening to what the character, putting the character in a situation, listening to what they would say, what they would do in a particular situation, whether they're close to you or not. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about Matthew Foster that's really close to me, and Karen White talked about how certain characters are close to her, but not really tying them really close to you. I mean, Meek Foster had some basic characteristics that are similar to me, but not so closely tied that I would force him to do exactly what I would do. He's definitely a different human being apart from myself, and he speaks to me instead of me forcing him to say exactly what I would say. Karen White talked a little bit about that, just, how characters would just show up, not unlike ghosts. They would just show up and speak to her, and she just had to write them in a certain way. But that story, there's a lot connected with that story that's really relevant to the writing process. I workshopped that one, and that one was that version of it, the story. I rewrote that story from a different POV. But that version of the story was about 30 pages long. And I workshopped it, and I was beholden to one of the worst things that I think. I mean, there's so many things I hate in workshops, but one thing in workshops that I think is overtly harmful, and there's no good justification for it, which is my professor at the time called it the cone of silence, but this is something that comes right out of Iowa. But the whole idea that you have to be quiet while you're being workshopped, and you have to submit it blind. You can't explain anything about it beforehand. You just have to give it as its own piece. And that story, the length was like 15 pages, so. It was a story I was in love with. In many ways, I'm still in love with it, and wish I could make it really work well. And I want to go back to it. I mean, that's true with so many stories. So I couldn't imagine doing a different story. And at the time, I had trouble writing shorter pieces, and I've cured that issue over the years. This was how many, 15 years ago at least. Over that span of time, I solved that problem. But I was interested in writing longer pieces at that time. I think at that point I had written one novel, and I was in the middle of writing another one, or in the process of. I wasn't really in the middle of writing it, but I was in the process of doing another novel. So I guess I was in the middle of a long piece, and I just had to, stop and write that piece at my kitchen table. Um, so I hadn't written The Living Needle quite yet, but The Living Needle was where I sort of resurrected the story. But in the workshop, I had to split it up in 15 pages, 15-page increments, because it was 30 pages, which was my average at the time. Most of the stuff I was writing was about that long. And in the workshop, they were treating it as a standalone story. I wrote a little thing beforehand, which was against the rules. A little thing beforehand saying, this is the first half. And they insisted that they had to treat it like a standalone story for some ungodly reason. And I don't even remember any of the advice. I didn't take any of the advice. And there were people in that workshop I love. And I have a complicated relationship with that workshop teacher. I didn't agree with most of his advice, but I don't hate the guy. I just didn't agree with most of his advice at all. And so I found the whole experience mostly useless. But I really don't remember what they said 15 years ago. But one of the things that I really loved in that story, and it's something that I've wanted to use since then, and it's whole cloth stolen from Samuel Beckett. There's your anxiety of influence. As I said, this story relates to a lot of stuff I talked about in past episodes. This is a much more personal episode, but it was an image from Endgame, and I was obsessed with Endgame. I'm still obsessed with Endgame. The Samuel Beckett's Endgame. I also love Avengers Endgame. Nothing against that. Absolutely love Avengers Endgame. But totally obsessed at the time. Still pretty much obsessed with Samuel Beckett's Endgame. And one of just the beautiful things about that play, there's so many beautiful things about that play. Rough for Theater 2 is my favorite, but Endgame is really up there. But one of the really beautiful things about that play, do you like Endgame? Do you like Endgame? Yes, I think Siko's an Endgame fan. You love Samuel Beckett, don't you? Don't you? Which Samuel Beckett character would you be? Would you be Lucky? I wouldn't want you to be Lucky. I want you to be Lucky, but not Lucky from Godot. But anyway, as this dog is trying to get into my lap, have you? I'm trying to do something. You doofy. You doofy dog. You doofy dog. What was it saying? Endgame. Endgame is probably the story that's closest to my marriage that I've ever seen. Me being Clove in that scenario. If you're familiar with Endgame, you'll see what I mean. Well, one of the images that's just beautiful that I love very much is there's a picture on the wall. Here it comes. Maggie. There's a picture on the wall turned around backwards. And there's no real reference to it. It's never explained. It's just, it's a picture on the wall turned around backwards. And the only real explanation is just that it's there to drive you crazy. It's like Chekhov's gun, and Chekhov's gun is just a cliche I hate. I think there's really no value to Chekhov's gun. Very little value to Chekhov's gun. It drives me crazy when people bring it up. They'll say Chekhov said if you load a gun at the beginning of the play, you have to shoot it by Act 2 or whatever, which is ridiculous. You can load a gun. Loading a gun is great at the beginning. Put a picture on the stage and turn it around. It's going to drive people crazy. But there's no reason whatsoever to explain it. This sort of relates to the last episode, which was all about how the Lost creators had no obligation to explain anything at all. Samuel Beckett has no obligation whatsoever to explain who Godot is. No obligation whatsoever to explain, like Rough for Theater 2, who the guy on the ledge is. No obligation whatsoever. I guess Rough for Theater 2 is kind of all about explaining who he is, but no obligation whatsoever to explain what that picture is. But it's just an idea that I love. And so in the workshop they would say, like there's an absent mother in the story. It's about Matthew Foster and his father, who's this really intense tennis coach. I probably could never do the story because I didn't realize at the time Infinite Jest is about tennis. So probably can't actually ever make that story work because I have no interest in Infinite Jest. I listened to a little bit of the audiobook and no insult on Infinite Jest, it just wasn't interesting. But I recognized it's about tennis. And my animals are going crazy. So that's one of those anxiety of influence things where, here's a quirky story about tennis. He must have been influenced by David Foster Wallace. No, not at all. More power to him. It's just, never really did it for me. But there's an absent mother, and I never explain what happened to the mother. I have no obligation to. I have no interest in explaining that kind of stuff. So, they would say, oh, probably the pictures of the mother, which is, whatever, that's fine. I had a picture, I totally stole it. That's something that very much influenced by Samuel Beckett, very much stole that image. But, I had a picture turned around and they guessed what it was probably about. They spent so much time just trying to figure that out. Whatever. I don't really care. Got no real actual advice about it, about the story. And so, some people that I loved, the whole story is about, some people that I love gave me bad advice in that class. But the whole story is about Matthew Foster comes to the sudden realization that there's no such thing as air, and that air is actually water and you can swim through it. So he just starts swimming through the air. But he's kind of meek, so he doesn't really, he's iffy about explaining that to people. So I had a friend who said, and I used a lot of complicated language just for fun. I enjoyed doing that. A lot of complicated sentences. I had a friend saying that the style didn't match the message, and that's part of the obstacle with that one is, I don't have an actual message. His Matthew Foster's philosophy is to simplify essential forces of the universe. There's only three essential, materials in the universe. That's not my philosophy. That's just his philosophy. And so I had a friend who said, his philosophy of simplicity doesn't match the prose. Sure, whatever. You should do simple prose when your philosophy is simplicity. Yeah, I mean, I get why you would say that, but I just have no interest in that. So, how does that work as advice? It doesn't. And he had a story that was very Borgesian story. If you know this person, you know who I'm talking about. It's a person I love very much. It's just that particular advice didn't really help that much. He had a very Borgesian story about a fly that looked like genitalia, and the whole workshop was just about how accurate it sounded to an encyclopedia, which I agree was a complete waste of time. So the whole thing was a waste of time. And they were treating it, they're treating my story like a standalone story so much, even though it was the first half. I had to write on the back of the page, this is just the first half. Stop treating. They would say things like, I don't know if that works as an ending. And I would have to, quietly indicate to them, you have it completely wrong. So yeah, the cone of silence is just a terrible thing because, and the blind submission is a terrible thing. I get conceptually why that was supposed to be a positive, but I've never experienced that as being a net positive. You're submitting something that as if it's a completed work, so you have to polish it as if it is a completed work. You're giving the audience or the workshop no indication of what your intention is. So you're treating them as if they're readers reading a journal, I guess is supposed to be the concept. But the way I read, if I'm flipping through a journal and I start reading a story I don't like, I just skip it because it's not my style. It's not my interest. And a lot of journals I do that. I skip it. It's not my interest. This is like David Foster Wallace, I didn't have enough interest in Infinite Jest to really keep going. But so what? Doesn't mean it's actually a bad story. I would never tell, I can't now, but I would never tell David Foster Wallace, you need to change this because I personally dislike it. That would be entirely irrelevant. But you're placing a story in a situation that imitates the process of a reader in reading a finished work and saying, what is your critique of the finished work? And that is the point at which the critique is by far the most irrelevant. Whereas if a piece is in an early stage, which, a workshop piece is, if a piece is in an early stage, you can say, this is working, I'm not sure how this is working, this is what I want to do with this piece based on my own taste. And somebody says, the prose should match the philosophy of the character. Then you could say, oh, but I'm not interested in that. And then we'll move on to more productive things. So yeah, that's a prime example of, workshopping that story. That was one of the most useless workshops I've ever been to. It had no effect on the story whatsoever. I ended up, just having my own personal problems with that particular story and that had nothing to do with the workshop whatsoever. So I never quite got it to a place I really wanted it to be. It was a very emotional story because it's a love story. Meek Foster's has this intense relationship with his best friend. It's subtextually this romantic sort of relationship, and that's and it had very much to do with my first girlfriend, and I've talked about this before, where she, from my perspective, and it's inaccurate, but it's from my perspective at the time, she OD'd on some kind of medicine, and supposedly she was trying to kill herself, and then I didn't see her again for 13 years, so it was a story sort of processing that emotion. And I've talked about this story before. Have you heard this story? I don't know if I've told you this story. Let me tell you this story. Where, I wrote a lot of stories processing that emotion. And I would argue, and I've talked about this before, I'm not writing about that intensely emotional experience in order to eliminate it, which is the classic interpretation of writing about really tragic things. But I'm writing about it to feel it again, which is an irrational thing to do. I'm accessing the strong feelings of my girlfriend going missing. So Matthew Foster ends up leaving. He has this friend named Artemis. He ends up leaving her. And so my novel, The Living Needle, which I started writing later. I guess that was the sequence. I started writing that later. And I took side branches to other stories while I was writing that one. I started writing that, I think, a year later. And Artemis is the main character in that one. And so I have this whole extended flashback sequence. She's an adult, but I have this whole extended flashback. She's 28, and I started writing that before I was 28. But she has this whole extended flashback where she's remembering Meek Foster learning to swim through the air and then leaving her. And it worked a whole lot better from her perspective, because that was my perspective. Having this person, you have this complicated in high school sort of a way, of course, but complicated relationship with who just suddenly disappears. So I was able to access a lot of those emotions there, and so it's not for the purpose of excising them, but for the purpose of feeling them. And I wrote so much about that, it's harder to access that anymore. And I miss it. I have this nostalgic feeling for this. I have this nostalgic feeling for this terrible feeling. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to make sure that I served that feeling. But then, if you think of characters as living characters, both of those characters left me, and I really miss them. But I just can't write about them anymore. Meek left Artemis in the story, and he left me. I wrote a handful of stories about him, and he just won't let me write about him anymore, which sounds crazy, But I've granted him subjecthood, so that he could choose to be in my story if he wants to be. And so a lot of the characters I write about now, are kind of egomaniacs who insist on being in my story. A lot of characters. I start writing about a story, I didn't even realize it was about a particular character. And they just butt their way into my story. But poor Matthew Foster, he flew away. And I had this whole backstory where he flew up into the clouds and he created this golden kingdom in the clouds. And I've never gotten around to writing about that because he just doesn't want me to. But maybe in the future, when The Living Needle becomes very popular, and I still haven't gotten around to the story of Meek Foster flying into the solid clouds and creating a golden city. I've had that as a little Easter egg every once in a while. But I've never fully fleshed that out as a story yet. But maybe when The Living Needle becomes the most popular book in the history of books, people will look back at this video. This is a real fantasy here. People will look back at this video and say, "Oh, that's what happened to Meek. He flew off." And I had this whole scene. I might have written it somewhere. All of this, not all of this. The Living Needle's all typed up, but I have a lot of extra little things handwritten. So I might have written this at some point. But the whole ending of the story is Artemis turns out to be this messianical figure. As you do, that old yarn. And so I had a flashback chapter where she just starts walking on the solid clouds, and then she walks up to the golden kingdom. 200 years later, she's immortal. Which is, something that's very different from the rest of the story. I like that as an ending, but I haven't really fully integrated that into the novel yet. But anyway, that's about it. I'm getting nostalgic and wistful and sentimental. This is from my son's birthday last year. His 7th birthday. He's about to turn 8. I'm definitely going to get real nostalgic about that. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode. It's 28 minutes. There's a sign right there. 28 is Artemis's number. 55 is Meek's number. Maybe I should write about Artemis again. She won't let me. She won't let me write about her again. Anyway, see you on the next episode.